Hi everyone, this is Ken Futernick, and I'm the host of a new program called Courageous Conversations about our schools. We launched it because the culture wars in education over how students should learn about race and racism, about health mandates, about whether some books should be banned from high school libraries, and how current events and controversial issues should be discussed. These wars are wreaking havoc on our public schools. Board meetings in many districts are no longer places where educators and parents and students listen and respectfully discuss important issues of the day. Instead, they've become battlegrounds. And as a result of these culture wars and new state laws that attempt to prescribe what teachers can do, in some cases giving the public the right to view what's going on in classrooms, teachers in many states are confused and frightened. Many of them, along with school administrators who are in short supply, are leaving the profession. So what we're doing is hosting a series of respectful conversations about the most controversial topics related to our schools to see if we can better understand one another and perhaps even to find some common ground. The topic for today's conversation is indoctrination, what it means, whether it's always a bad thing, and whether students are really getting educated or indoctrinated. We have a wonderfully diverse group of people participating in the conversation, a high school student, some who are parents, a school board member, and some who are or were teachers in the past. And to help ensure the conversation is respectful and productive, each participant has agreed to follow a short list of conversation agreements. These agreements are similar to ones used by a terrific organization called Living Room Conversations that has hosted many meetings like this among people with opposing viewpoints on highly controversial subjects. By the way, the hosts in these conversations are encouraged to participate along with the guests. So that's why you'll hear me chiming in from time to time in response to the questions about indoctrination. Okay, so let's meet our guests. Erika, Sanzi, let's start with you. Say a few words about where you're from and your connection to education and this topic.
Sure. So my name is Erika Sanzi. I live in Rhode Island. I am the mother of 3 boys in 7th grade, 9th grade, and 11th grade. I was a teacher for a decade. I served on my local school committee for 1 term. And I am currently the director of outreach at a somewhat new organization called Parents Defending Education. And indoctrination in the classroom is one of many topics that we sort of deal with and talk about every day.
Great. Thanks, Erika. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kristin, let's go to you. Tell our group and that are participating with us and our listeners a little bit about you.
My name is Kristin Allan. I'm currently serving on the Cherry Creek School District Board of Education. I was just elected back in November. I have 2 children in our public schools. They are in 1st grade and 5th grade. And I have been volunteering in our schools, both on the school level and the district level, since my oldest started kindergarten.
Great. Welcome, Kristin. Glad you're here with us. Josie, Reich, let's go to you next. Introduce yourself and tell us about what you do.
Hi, I'm Josie, and I'm a senior at School Without Walls High School in downtown DC, which is right near the White House. And I am interested in this issue. I have been for my entire high school career, and each senior at my school writes a senior project, so a paper on an issue that they care about, and I wrote mine on the idea of political polarization and effective political discussion. And then I worked as an organizer with the organization Braver Angels, which works to bridge political divides and get people talking across party lines, and worked to create the workshop Depolarizing Within for Teens. I also work as a youth peer health educator with the Young Women's Project and DC Department of Health. So I directly interact with my peers that way too, and provide information and education and referrals and things like that. So yeah, so I'm involved in my school community in those few ways.
Welcome, Josie. Thanks for that nice introduction. Krystle, let me come to you next. Tell us where you live and what your connection to schools is.
Sure. My name is Krystle Williams. I am a teacher in Cleveland, Ohio, in Cleveland Metropolitan School District. I actually teach at the school that I attended as a child. I work also for Living Room Conversations. I'm their racial equity partner. And at my school, I do a lot of the DEI and belonging work for my fellow teachers as well.
Great, thank you, Krystle. And Joe, finally, tell us about you, where you live, and what you do.
Well, thanks for having me, Ken. My name is Joe Murray. I am from right outside Memphis, Tennessee. Originally from New Jersey, though, still have those Garden State roots. I was a lawyer for 15 years and still am. It's kind of like the mafia. They don't let you out once you join. And during that time as a lawyer, I did civil rights law and did a lot with education, represented a lot of students from all different viewpoints, whether it was whether to join a certain club or whether or not they could have a religious message in a graduation speech. Education has always been my passion. So Lord willing, I was able to join the education field about 5 years ago. And now I have really, I say I haven't worked a day in my life since then because I enjoy it too much. But I teach 7th grade world history and current events and have to plug it, but I just released a book, Take Back Education, which tries to help people figure out how to get education back from the brink where I think it is right now, public education, that is.
Great show. Thanks for a nice intro, and thanks for joining this courageous conversation today about indoctrination. Finally, there's me, our host, and just share a little bit about myself. I was an elementary school teacher for a while, the parent of some kids who have all graduated from school. I was a teacher educator at California State University for close to 30 years. And now I have been hosting a podcast called Teacher Stories, which is a podcast that celebrates the profound and long-lasting impact that many teachers have on their students. And so that's something I've really enjoyed doing. And this new venture is something I'm really excited about. And I'm thrilled that this is our first episode in this new series on courageous conversations about our schools. My first question is, well, actually, before we get to our first question, we're going to just share with each other and with our listeners what our conversation agreements are. And I just want to say that what you're about to hear is not going to be a debate about indoctrinations. Its purpose is not for people to try to get others to change their minds, although people might change their minds over the course of this time or afterwards. But it's really about speaking from the heart, sharing one's own experiences, and listening, really listening to better understand one another. So I'd like for each of you to read one of the conversation agreements that all of us consented to. And Erika, I'll start with you, and I think you might have that in front of you.
I do. So the first conversation agreement is to be curious and listen to understand.
Great, thank you. Kristin, yours?
Show respect and suspend judgment.
Okay, and Josie, your agreement?
Limit contributions to allowed time limits.
I do want to say that the allowed time limit is going to be about 2 minutes, and some of the responses to some of the questions will probably take less, and others, it'll be frustrating. You'll want to say a lot more, as will I, and I'm going to be the timekeeper, and when we begin, any of you starts to talk, I'm going to hit my timer, and if it gets close to the 2 minutes, I'm just going to do this friendly signal that it's time to wind up. Joe, I'd say, Krystle, let me have you read the next agreement.
Sure. Allow others to speak without interruption.
Okay, for this conversation, as much as we might want to say, but can you just explain this, or would you elaborate on that, or how about this? We're not going to do that. And then Joe, you have one that you can read.
Yeah, just basically to seek common ground and to understand that we might not change minds, but at least we can open ears.
Right, great. And the final one is that I want us all to own and help guide the conversation. So I want to suggest a hand signal that you put up in the camera, which is this. If you think that any of these agreements have been missed by anyone, and I'll pause and allow you to say what your concern is. So if I forget to keep track of time and someone's been going on, please put your thumb up. All right, we're going to start with the first question. And these are sort of some personal questions, not necessarily about indoctrination yet. But what do you recall from your own experiences as a student that had a positive impact on your life? And I think, Erika, we'll start with you.
So when I think back to positive impacts of having been a student, I had the blessing of going to a school where they pushed you hard. And so what comes to mind immediately, especially as I compare it to what I see happening with my own children now, is that there was an expectation that we were going to work hard. There was an expectation that this always comes to mind, that you would form a thesis statement and then you would back it up with evidence. I think that that's sort of like, even though that happened a lot in just maybe English class and potentially social studies, I see it as really important in a much broader sense, in the way that we have conversations with people and also in the way that we take in information and news. I would also say that, like, it's, again, I'm comparing it right now, I'm thinking more about academics, and I think it's because I don't see this like I sort of wish I did sometimes, which is that there was a lot of writing expected. There was a lot of reading expected. There was a lot of, discussion about real issues through literature. So those are my academic things. And the other thing I would just say is, of course, there are a few teachers that come to mind, teachers that when I hear that they're sick or that they've passed away, it's a time for me to reflect. I actually wrote something about one of my favorite teachers in recent years when he passed. And so, but I think high expectations and this idea that like working hard was good for you is something that I think about when I think back to my time as a student, particularly in high school.
Great, and you you made it in the time limit, so that's terrific. And 15 seconds to go. But and this question, some of these questions, you don't have to use the whole 2 minutes if you don't want to. But Kristin, let me come to you next.
So similar to Erika, I went to both elementary and high schools where the expectations were very high from an academic standpoint. And one of the things that I think about often is, especially in high school, when my English teachers discovered that I have had a love of reading, they would go out of their way to recommend books and bring books in for me to borrow that were not on the curriculum, but I just couldn't get enough of reading. And as it turns out, I am in my career as a lawyer, I read and write all day long. That's what I do. And then any free minute that I have, whether I'm in the, cooking dinner or in the car, I am always listening to more books. It's my foundation for my learning, and I am grateful for that. I would say I did go to a parochial school, and I think about that impact, and I'm trying to put a positive spin on it. The school that I went to, I often witnessed a lot of racism towards the brown and black girls in my school, particularly from the nuns that were teaching. And I think that is, well, although it was a bad experience to witness, I think it is positive because it started opening my eyes to the different experiences people were having. My friends that were that were going through the same education as me, but were experiencing very different things. So that's what I have to share.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Krystle, let me come to you next.
Sure. So I think like Kristin and Erika said, this idea of like working hard and really instilling that. I loved to read as a child, and some of the most impactful teachers were my English teachers because I think they took notice in that and sort of fostered that love for learning. I also really just enjoyed school because it was a safe place for me. Like I enjoyed the routines of it. I had an absentee mother, and so I had a number of like female teachers who filled in that role for me, but they didn't know that they were filling in that role because I was too embarrassed to tell anybody about what was happening in my home life. Um, and I told them years later as an adult, now that I see them at school. But I would say, other than academics, just that security and safety of routine and knowing that I had people there who cared about me.
Oh, thank you, Krystle. And now we'll come to you, Josie. Share one experience or something about your school experience that's been really had a positive impact for you.
Well, I'm still a high schooler for another few months, so I don't have the hindsight yet. But what I do find very impactful, in my day-to-day school life when I go now is various like clubs that I'm involved with and that I lead at my school. So my school is also an academically competitive school. It's a magnet school. And part of that is that they don't give much support to the students, and I'm sure that's not great for some people at the school, but for me, it's allowed me to see exactly where I want to spend my time and sort of like a choose your own adventure type approach to my high school education. So one thing I've chosen to spend a lot of time on is doing clubs with the school. So and teachers have always been willing and excited to sponsor those clubs and to help me like make things a reality. So for example, last year, another student and I wanted to create a literary magazine. And so we approached a teacher about it, and now we are producing our third edition. And I think the theme in all of my schooling that has been the points where I've been excited have been when people have let me be creative with the work that I'm doing, and that extends to within the classroom as well. So when I'm able to like choose between prompts or choose the book that I want to read for something, or have creativity in the assignment, that's where I've found the biggest impact.
Oh, great, thank you, Josie. And Joe, tell us what had a positive experience on you from your school experience.
Well, I know it might not sound positive, but my teachers let me lose. Some of the best lessons that I've ever lost is when I struggled and I lost and I failed. And I was able to then to have the option to, do I sit here in failure, or do I pick myself up by my bootstraps and do I try again? And I had a really good group of teachers who knew just how to play that delicate balance of not forcing me to try, but also not discouraging me to try, which is a very, very tough balance to do sometimes, because sometimes you want to get in there and you want to get the kid to do what you think is right and what needs to be done. And, that whole element of competition is what sort of shaped my view of not just education, but in the world, that yes, fail often, but learn from those failures and you will soon succeed. And the one thing I'm just very fortunate of is because I had a very good group of creative teachers where I went to school in New Jersey, is they weren't really hamstrung by these educational standards that sort of choke teachers' creativity, and they sort of create a world of mediocrity. And I'm just very fortunate that I grew up at a time period when you were able to have competition. Everything wasn't scripted, and you weren't tied to these standards that I think is really hurting the creativity in most public schools today.
Great, thank you, Joe. And just finally on myself, I was reflecting on this question, and I remembered a teacher I had in high school some years ago. It was a guy named Mr. Heathcote, social studies teacher who, and this was during the Vietnam War. So we were studying the Vietnam War. He brought in a lot of different perspectives into the class, and he really knew that we were all thinking about it a lot personally, because we were all about to turn 18 years old, and many of us might be drafted. But what he did was he asked us to get perspectives about the war from lots of different people, from parents, from our friends. There were some people that were against the war and some people that were signing up and enlisting and wanting to go. But also he wanted us to think about what would the perspective be from someone living in South Vietnam? How about North Vietnam? And he really wanted to encourage us to form our own opinions, which is kind of related to what we're about to talk about, which is the difference between indoctrination and education. I think he was truly a great educator. And I was, I think some of my teaching, the way that I tried to teach was related back to the teaching that he did. So, so now the next question, I think I'd like to ask that we try to answer this one briefly. We could go on about it, but I just would like to go around quickly and have each of us identify one thing that you hope schools accomplish for students without necessarily elaborating too much, but just identify what that thing would be. And it doesn't have to be the most important thing that you would like to see schools do. But Kristin, let me start with you.
Right now, Colorado has a 49% average reading proficiency rate by third grade. What I want to see schools accomplish is to provide every child with the ability to read. I just can't believe how many kids we're losing through the cracks because, you know, so many years later in their education, when they should be reading to learn, not learning to read, they still haven't gotten the fundamental basics. And I know we're working on that, but you know, working on it and actually seeing results are two different things. And it just kills me to think that children don't have that opportunity in school in the United States.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Josie, how about you? What's one really important thing schools should be doing?
My hope is that schools give students the confidence to make mistakes and not feel shame.
Great, thank you, Josie. Kristin?
I would say my hope is that schools, that we are providing tools and helping students foster skills that allow them to move in the world and not hurt other humans.
Great. Thank you, Krystle. Erika, how about you?
Well, I just need to first say that what Kristin said is also how I feel in terms of that, the very basic. I mean, we're not getting the basics right. I was literally on the radio today talking about this. Colorado has much higher reading literacy rates than my state of Rhode Island. And in the city of Providence, only 8% of 8th grade boys read on grade level. So 92% do not. But that brings me to my real answer to this question, which is that, and I've kind of stolen this from a friend over the years. So his name's Darrell Bradford. So, you know, hat tip to him for what I'm about to say, but he always talks about our responsibility to give students the skills and the knowledge to become the best versions of themselves, and as decided by them. And clearly there's a lot of things that go into that beyond reading, but if we're not even getting the reading part right, you know, we're looking at a lifetime of struggles. But to become the best version of themselves is my sort of mantra in all of this.
Great, thank you, Erika. Joe, let's come to you. What's one thing that you want schools to be doing?
Well, I would hope that by the time that everybody graduates, that they are both educated in both mind and morals, in the sense that they understand the values and the core ethics of Western and classical education.
Great. Thank you for that. And finally, I'll just say that one thing that I think is important that I think is too often marginalized is a really rich education in the arts, performing arts, and visual arts, industrial arts. I think some of the most enjoyable classes I had were in those areas. I think I learned what it meant to be creative. A lot of times I did things with other people and had to learn to collaborate and appreciate what they're doing. And I think it's really an essential part of the curriculum and not a frill. And I just want to put my 2 cents in for more arts and education and really integrating it with the curriculum. Okay, we're going to move on from these 2 questions about what we want from our schools and what our own personal experiences were, to questions about the key topic today, which is about indoctrination. And I think it's always so important to begin a conversation when you're talking about a controversial topic by defining our terms. And so we're going to start by asking all of you to speak within the 2-minute time frame about what indoctrination means in your mind and how it differs from education. So I think, Erika, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So when I think of the word indoctrination, and I first want to acknowledge, I know that this word can be like, it's kind of a flashpoint word for some people. They have a negative reaction to it, which is maybe worth exploring at some point. I don't have that reaction to it. To me, it's the best word for what we're talking about. And if there's another one out there that means the same thing, I'd be happy to use that one. But to me, it's the process. And in the process of teaching students, in this case, to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. So to me, it's when something is being taught almost as if it's gospel, as opposed to something that we teach as one perspective or one point of view, or you can see it this way if you look at it through this lens, but if you look at it through this lens, and your example about Vietnam kind of comes to mind. If you were to only present the Vietnam War through one perspective and teach that as though this is the war, right? This is all you need to know, that would fall into this category. And there's 2 examples I often use. I may not get through both of them. I might get the signal, but there's 2 that I use that I think have come up a lot recently in classrooms. One of them is the topic of voter ID. And what we've noticed increasingly as we look at websites and lesson plans and just, what's happening in classrooms is that the education version of voter ID being discussed in class would really be that you present students with the most compelling arguments for voter ID and the most compelling arguments against it. And students would read those, they might work together and discuss them, and then they would land where they land and they would back that up with evidence. What we're increasingly seeing now is, and this is a quote, we're seeing a lot of voter ID is racist being taught to students. And I would put that in the category of indoctrination in the classroom.
Great. Thank you, Erika. Krystle, how about you?
I'm going to echo some of what Erika said, because that's literally what I wrote in my notes. The idea that we are teaching students and providing theories for them, but not allowing them to be critical of them. Just, this is the way it is, and this is the perspective that I'm giving you, and don't ask questions because this is how we do things in the United States. I think it's different than education. No, I'm going to stop there.
Okay. All right. Joe, how about you?
I think we're kind of hitting the nail on the head. How I view indoctrination is teaching conclusions that if you question, you're either demonized or maligned, or you are shown the door. I would add one thing to it. It also has the authority of the state behind it. So it's not just, Joe Blow on the street corner saying this is how it is. you have the complete authority of the state in which you teach, endorsing a message which sends chilling effects to anyone that dares to question. Growing up in New Jersey, I had beliefs that were somewhat not normal for that state area. And, my teachers, thankfully, they had a good banter with me. But if you didn't have an argumentative personality or someone that loved to debate, you could very well be what I would call chilled into silence and not questioning it. And, I see this all the time. I had a conversation not too long ago with someone in another district saying, well, we were talking about Winston Churchill, and the student said, oh, he's racist. I said, okay. So why is he racist? Oh, yeah, we were taught he said bad things. He's racist. Now, look, you can come to that conclusion if you want, but what indoctrination does, it just has you reach what I call conclusory allegations, and you never provide meat to the bones. And to me, that's what indoctrination is.
Josie, what does indoctrination mean to you, and how does it differ from education?
Well, I think indoctrination and education are pretty much opposites. I think indoctrination is teaching what that one thing is right and not to be questioned, and then education is teaching a concept and then teaching critical thinking and making sure that the concept is thought about through multiple different lenses and perspectives, similar to what everyone else has been saying. But yeah, for example, when you learn about things in history class, you often learn to think about them through their social, political, religious, technological, and some other ramifications. That's one way that you take a battle or like a trade system and then look at it in different lights and how the different parts are interconnected, and you can apply that same thing if you're talking about a current event, a political situation, a belief about something in the news. Another example is a lesson I recently had in my government class, where after learning about different styles of governance, we divided into groups and then tried to create our own government design from scratch. So sort of taking each thing and thinking about it, I think critically is the key word.
And Kristin, love to hear your thoughts on this question of what indoctrination is in your mind.
So I echo what everybody else has said. It sounds like we're all thinking the same way about the definition. I kind of like to sum it up with indoctrination is basically answering the question of why, because I said so, without giving the facts, without teaching the facts, without teaching those critical thinking skills. And education is answering the question of why with providing the facts and information to get to that answer. I think that some examples of indoctrination, since we're talking about history, are when schools and teachers are kind of using their, I guess I would say, implicit bias when they're teaching history. I'll give one example. Recently, I saw a first year or ninth grade essay requirement where the students were given a list of 50 names of historical figures, artists, just you name it, across the board, a whole bunch of different categories of people, and they were asked to select one and write about that person. And 90% of the people on the list were white men. And I think that it contributes to the indoctrination of our students to believe that the only people that matter in history and in our life are these mostly white men with some other outliers of Black and brown people and women. And then and then I will save the rest for later. So that's it.
Hey, thanks, Kristin. We just got to the end of your time allocation there. So I'm just going to offer this perspective that I agree with. I think what everyone said, that it's an indoctrination to me is an attempt to try to get other people or students, if it's in school, to believe something, to hold a perspective simply because we said it's true, when without giving them the opportunity to decide for themselves or to study whether they in fact think it's true themselves. Education, on the other hand, I think is creating the conditions for our students to adopt their own perspectives, provided that it's their perspectives or beliefs, points of view are based on reasons and evidence, and when it's appropriate, on sound moral thinking. Because sometimes we want kids to develop values, and they really have to do with our sort of moral positions. And so it is giving kids the freedom and encouraging them to develop their own perspectives. I think if we were to find a social studies teacher that's teaching about economics and was promoting socialism as the preferred economic model, or the only economic model, that would be a form of indoctrination. And it would be indoctrination too if a teacher was simply promoting or exclusively promoting and studying capitalism and didn't introduce kids to other forms of economic thinking like socialism. So I think with that, we're going to move to our next question, which gets sort of into the nuance of indoctrination. I think, as Erika pointed out before, we sometimes tend to react. Indoctrination is kind of a pejorative term, it's a negative term. So we react and say, well, that's not a good idea and shouldn't be doing it. But the question now that I'd like you to respond to is indoctrination ever acceptable? Is it ever happen in schools when we say that's not necessarily a bad thing? And I think Josie, we'll start with you on that one.
I mean, my short answer is no, with the definition of indoctrination that we all sort of hinted at. I think it's always important to think critically about what you're being introduced to. And I think, well, my closest example of seeing this around me is a few years ago when I was a freshman at my school. There was a senior who left the school and sued, claiming to have been bullied for her political affiliation, which I live, in the most like liberal part of the country, and she was on the very opposite end of the political spectrum, and she was probably one of the only ones in my school. But the end result of the whole situation was that the school didn't do much about it, and the student body laughed her off, and it became sort of a joke, and there wasn't any addressing by the school of the culture within the student body. And as moved along by the administration, that allowed for a student to not feel safe or respected or able to express her opinions because she held a minority viewpoint. And so I was first introduced to this idea of sort of like a groupthink mentality a few years ago. And so I know firsthand the effect of disregarding an opinion that is different from what most people around you believe. And so I think it's very important to make sure that learning environments don't allow for that at all.
Thank you, Josie. Joe, how about you? Is indoctrination ever acceptable?
I think as we defined it here today, no, but I think we also have to understand that to work in a society, we have to come to an agreement that there are absolute truths, and we agree as to what absolute truth we are going to adhere to. John Locke would call that the social contract. John Jay wrote about that in Federalist 2, saying what it was able to bind these 13 disparate colonies together was they shared the same language, the same religion, the same culture, the same heroes, the same villains. And you need to have that sense of unity as a country in order to move forward. Because what happens is if we cannot agree on who we are, then we risk the very real danger of balkanizing and becoming basically tribal camps that will set up shop in certain parts of the country and will be teaching and doing different things, not critically thinking, but just doing it instinctively as being sort of a protection mechanism. And I think one of the biggest things that has really come into education is not necessarily indoctrination, which is a big thing, but this sense of moral relativism, which we can't say there's a right or wrong without the fear of hurting someone's feelings. There is a right or wrong. And I think as a society, we have to decide what that is. And if we can't decide what that is, are we a society? So no, we do not have indoctrination in the classroom, but yes, we do have to have certain principles that we all adhere to that they believe are absolute and true and are worthy of our defense.
Thank you, Joe. Erika, let's come to you. Is indoctrination acceptable? Is it unavoidable, or should we try to should teachers do everything they can and principals do everything they can to keep it out of the classroom?
I echo what everyone has said so far on this. I think it is really important to steer clear of it as much as you can. That doesn't mean that, that I think what happens is then people get so extra nervous about it that then they think they can't even, they can't even talk about the State of the Union, or they can't even talk about, oh my goodness, my dogs just came in and they're wrestling. So I'll keep it short right now. But but I think it is, and I think that also Josie's point about groupthink, I think that is really important, because what has happened is as the political tribes, let's just call them, have sort of decided not just, I don't agree with your philosophy, or I don't agree with your opinion on this, but they've begun to demonize people and dehumanize one another so that the other becomes a caricature. Right. And you see this especially in places where everybody who lives near there, 95% are Democrats or 95% are Republicans. I am blessed to live in a town, believe it or not, it exists, that if you split us up, we're like a red blue pie, half and half. So I think that you get away from some of this because your neighbors and the people you carpool with and the people that you see around, like, you're not caricatures, you're just regular people. But so, yeah, I think you steer clear from this, but you also, I think, don't overcorrect to the point where you don't feel like you can have, conversations in the hallways or with your students about topics that touch on politics, history, the culture wars, just that it's not, I'm on the right side of history, you're evil. That's where I feel like we're really wrong and we need to right the ship.
Thanks, Erika. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And I think it's working. I think we're hearing and people are listening to one another and having a courageous conversation about an interesting, complicated topic and doing it in a way that's respectful. Kristin, I'm going to come to you next.
I think that it's never acceptable for teachers to indoctrinate students. I've heard a lot about it in this campaign and the beginning of my tenure on the school board. I think indoctrination is fundamentally opposed to education and teaching. And I am concerned that the term is being used and thrown around as a scare tactic. I think we really need to, if we're concerned about what our teachers are teaching, I think they deserve much more than a soundbite regarding this scary term that frightens so many people. I think that every question that kids ask, from why can't I cross the street, because I said so, only gets you so far. The answer of because you'll get hurt and don't ask again is different than because I said so, and it's going to that impact, you know, age appropriate and development appropriate is so much. It will be so much different.
Thank you, Kristin. Krystle, let's come to you. Just to remind our audience what question we're speaking about, as we've all defined what we think indoctrination is, and now what we're talking about is whether it's ever acceptable. So what are your thoughts about that?
So based on our definition, I don't think it's ever acceptable. However, I do think there are examples where schools are doing this. And the example I'll give is saying the Pledge of Allegiance. We don't do it in my district at the high school level, but at the district that I work in and in several of the districts around me, we say the Pledge of Allegiance. My 10-year-old niece says it. I said it when I was a child. And this idea that America is the best, you pledge allegiance, you don't really question it. I think a lot of what's happening is, depending on what you look like and where you're from, America could be the best country ever. And if you look a different way, it might not be the best country ever. And I think it can be hard to reconcile with that when you've always been told this is the best country, everyone has a fair shot, everyone is treated equally. And then you learn that that's not true, either through your own experiences or you hear about it from others. But if it hasn't happened to you personally, or maybe to someone you know, it can be hard to believe that, because we are taught from a very young age that this is a country where liberty and justice for all, no matter what. And so I use that example of the Pledge of Allegiance because that's the last line. And that's something that stuck with me growing up. Like I mean, in school, like you worked hard, you did what you were supposed to do, and you were going to have a fair shot because you worked hard, you did what you needed to do, and that was that. And I saw many people around me who are not treated as a full and complete American because of what they look like, or other parts of their identity. And so while I don't think it's acceptable to indoctrinate students based on the definition that we all provided, I think it definitely still happens in schools.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go last year and say something that maybe a little different from what all of you said, because I think we do indoctrinate sometimes, and I think it's actually acceptable. I want to give an example. And of course, it depends on what we mean by it. But I'm thinking about young children who come into school, kindergartners, first graders, and we have rules and we have values about how you're supposed to treat each other. You're supposed to be kind. It's not okay to take other people's stuff. It's not okay to cheat. And they don't really have a choice in the matter. And so that is sort of a form of indoctrination. I think, Joe, it goes back to what you were saying, is there certain, I don't know if I'd call them absolutes, but maybe they're sort of commonly agreed upon values. But here's what I would say, I think what we do have a choice about beyond inculcating certain values about how you treat other people, that when kids violate those expectations and take something from someone else or bully another kid, if we just punish, and, suspend kids or simply punish, it typically doesn't cause the behavior to stop. They just learn to try to avoid getting caught the next time. On the other hand, if, say, when kids are bullying or teasing others, rather than punish, if we have kids engage in what are called restorative practices and listen to the people, hear from the people that have been teased or bullied, they often get a sense of the pain that they've caused, and it's more likely to lead to what we want, which is that they stop bullying, not because they're fearful that they would get punished, but because they realize that they've had an impact on someone that they didn't realize. And that, I think, is going from indoctrination. It's important to behave this way to education, where we want them to understand the reasons why we're teaching something. With that, I'm going to move to our third question about indoctrination. And the question is this: is it indoctrination when teachers teach their students to be kind, to be patriotic, or to embrace and promote, say, a concept like social justice? Is that necessarily indoctrination? And I want to, let's see, we're going to start, let me start with you, Joe, and I'll work my way down from Joe, then to Erika, and then Krystle, and so forth.
That's a great question. What I have seen with indoctrination, when you look at social justice, I've often said, get 20 teachers in a room and ask them to define social justice, and you get 20 different definitions. It's one of those terms that's used not because it means something, because of the avenues it creates into getting something in. In researching my book, I saw so many examples of how kids were saying, well, you're white, so you're automatically coming at this with a racist tendency. Now, I was in civil rights law for 15 years, and I did my best to fight for race claims, gender claims, religion claims. And the basis of that fight was that we don't see color, we see character. And what we are seeing now is that being rewound to where you have to see color, and you use color now to differentiate among people. You indict others and you victimize others. And that to me is very dangerous, because it goes against that key aspect of individualism. And I think you're right that we have not been a perfect country. No country has. I think every civilization known to man has engaged in the practice of slavery. But I ask, what country has done the most to stop and correct it? Not perfect, far from it. The only folks that are perfect are up with the good Lord. And that's about it. But this country has done so much to try to right those wrongs, sometimes slower rather than others. And I think what we're seeing is a reverse indoctrination, where we are taking down the pillars of the West. If you look at what happened in 2020, right? Everybody that was under siege was one of the fathers of Western civilization. Was there a disproportionate representation? Yes. And it was partly due to the times. But does that minimize their accomplishments? Absolutely not. And I think these terms that we throw around now, racist and sexist, without knowing the full context, that is the ugliness of indoctrination.
Joe, thank you for that. Erika, your thoughts about whether it's possible to teach students to be patriotic or to embrace and promote social justice without indoctrination, without it being indoctrination.
I immediately think of former President Obama. You guys probably remember, he used to say a lot, my story is only possible in the United States of America. And so he was never implying that it was perfect or that it, wasn't covered in all sorts of warts. But he was saying definitively that there wasn't any other place that would offer the same opportunities for him, as the United States, right? So I wouldn't, so let's just say that a lesson, they jump off of that quote from a former president. That to me isn't indoctrinating in patriotism. That's having, an honest conversation about what are we? And so just like some sort of patriotic ideal, sort of, jingoistic version of history would never be acceptable. It's also not acceptable to teach students, and I have to say, I fear this is beginning to happen, that we're an irredeemably racist, white supremacist nation. I mean, the truth lies right in the middle, and we're always striving to be better. On the issue of social justice, there's a big definition problem here, because we're going to define that differently, right? So when I tell you that the boys can't read in my capital city, to me, social justice is ensuring that they read because of the direct line from illiteracy to incarceration. But if you asked me to put one of the signs in my front yard, in this house, we believe in XYZ or some other sort of slogan, I wouldn't do that, because that isn't how I define social justice. And I would say the same thing, like I've been a school choice advocate for a decade. Again, I think residential school assignment is unjust. And so therefore, I would say my version of social justice is to give parents more options. So I worry about social justice partly because of what Joe said, but also because it's just, its definition is so amorphous.
Krystle, let's hear from you. Talk about social justice and patriotism and whether they can and should be taught and whether you can do it without indoctrinating.
Sure. Actually, I wanted to touch on being kind too. Joe mentioned like social like truths and things like that. And I feel like being kind is something that we can ask our students to do and treat our students to do, and or excuse me, not treat our students, but ask our students to do. And I feel like that's something that everyone can agree on. I know I shouldn't speak in generalizations, but I think asking students to be kind is something that is okay. Being patriotic, so I think when I think about patriotism, I think oftentimes so I'll speak from my experience. I grew up in the era of color blindness. We don't see color, things like that. I graduated high school in 2003. And I really believed that like people would just see me for my character and for my accomplishments. And I thought racism was over. Like I just read that was something that happened like in the South and that it was over. And the first time I was called the N-word, it was in Cleveland, Ohio, in the North. And so I think when we talk about patriotism, how do we make space for students who have experienced these things, be it because of their gender or because of their race, and still hear that they want to like love their country, but they're still, how do we help them work through experiences that they have had that have not been positive in this country? How do we do that? Allow them to make space for talking about things that they would like to improve, and talk about things that maybe are not positive that have happened as it relates to patriotic, without ostracizing them and saying like, well, you must not love your country. Like you're just focusing on race and you're just focusing on all of the bad things.
Kristin.
I generally think it's indoctrination when we're teaching kindness, patriotism, or promotion of social justice without providing the facts and again, I think that these are all ideas that can be good and can be bad. I don't want my child to be kind to her bully. I don't want to tell somebody who has experienced injustice that they must be patriotic. And I don't want I don't want any teacher to promote social justice without explaining, without providing the education of what all of these things are. I just, you need to keep giving the why. You need to keep providing and educating on the facts and the data and the information so our kids can decide whether they want to be these things.
Josie, how about you?
I think similar to what Joe was mentioning earlier with absolute truths, I don't know that I don't know personally that there are absolute truths, but I do think it's important for society to operate off some mutual agreements. And I think schools have a responsibility to educate students for citizenship within that society. And so it is a tough line to walk sometimes when you get into things like where students' First Amendment rights dip into sort of like bullying or dip into disrupting the ability of others to learn, and where that requires interference and like stopping the students' speech in that way. So in some places it's a tough balancing act between allowing full expression of everyone's personal values and the fundamental things that are necessary for a group to run smoothly as a group. But I think that the examples here, kindness, patriotism, social justice, and other underlying values like that, kindness is probably the easiest one to agree upon there, and other things like that, like the pursuit of like truth and belief in truth, and there are a number of other things you could say. I think that those are characteristics of any functional society, and the school isn't indoctrinating by making sure that, yes, with facts, of course, but that students understand those.
Thank you, Josie. And I don't think I have too much to add. I guess what I would say about those concepts, I think there's a common theme in what we're talking about, is that some of these concepts, the definitions are not agreed upon, and they're unclear. And what I would want from teachers talking about patriotism is to ask their students, what does it mean to love your country? What does it mean to be patriotic? Is it possible to love your country when your country has not lived up to the ideals that it set out to accomplish? What does it mean? What does social justice really mean? Is it embedded in our Constitution? Is it one of our founding principles? And but I think if you walked into a classroom where teachers were asking those questions, I think we'd all agree that education was going on and not indoctrination, because they're having kids define it, and they're conceding the point that we may all have different definitions of what it means. So let's explore that together and get different people's perspectives before we decide we're for or against it. But I sort of think what I'm hearing from everyone is that that we're kind of talking about the same thing. We're talking about teaching these in a way that isn't indoctrinating and allowing kids to form their own opinions based on reasons and evidence. So I think with that, we're going to move to our final couple of questions and just now reflect a bit on what we've just been doing. So I want to ask each of you to talk briefly about what you learned or what you will take away from the conversation you've had today. And so let me go in reverse order. Josie, let me come to you and ask you, what do you take away from the conversation we just had?
Well, I think that if you put this group of people in a classroom to discuss like a specific political or historical thing or idea, there would be a pretty wide range of viewpoints about it. And yet we all had very similar definitions for indoctrination, and all agreed that it's not an okay thing to have as part of education, and that it's important to think critically and hear each other out. And so there was definitely more variation in responses and more clash of opinions as the conversation progressed and the questions got more specific. But I think that so that's one thing I'm thinking about, is that probably a lot of people are willing to listen to other perspectives, and now I'm interested, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, sort of preempting the next couple of questions, but I'm interested, I would love to hear the more in-depth beliefs of what other people hinted at, and what they've worked on. And so, if classrooms could all also come from that base belief that indoctrination is, not an okay thing, then that would be, that would hopefully lead the discussion to similarly interesting places.
Thank you, Josie. Kristin, how about you? What do you take away from this? And I'm going to combine the second question with it, is has your thinking about any of this changed in any way as a result of our conversation today?
My takeaway is in listening to everybody's answers. I once again am reminded that we are all passionate about education and teaching and providing a great education for our kids. And we may have different views about, just different political views and how we get there. But if the end goal is we all share in common and is educating our children, we're in better shape than the media is presenting us to be. So,
yeah.
And has my thinking changed in every way? I think my thinking changes a little bit every time I hear different perspectives, because the more I learn, the better I am. So thank you all for sharing your perspectives.
Thanks, Kristin. Krystle, how about you? What's your takeaway from today? And has your thinking changed at all about this topic of indoctrination?
Sure. Just again, piggybacking off what people have said, this idea that we're all passionate about education, and that we agree that we all defined indoctrination as having this negative connotation, and we want our kids to be educated and critical thinkers. And like knowing that we agree on that, like how do we talk about and work through the things we don't agree on for the benefit of our kids, right? Because they will eventually be running the world, and we want to make sure that they have what they need. I'm taking away this idea of absolute truths that Joe mentioned earlier. Like I really do want to think more about that and what these absolute truths in the United States are. And if they look different for different groups, like how can we still come together as Americans and not be so polarized? So that's sort of my takeaway, what I'm thinking about right now.
Thank you, Krystle. Erika, how about you?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that Josie is totally bringing back memories of when I taught high school. And I have all boys, so I'm the mother of 3 sons. And so it was always my students that gave me my girl fixes. And so I've been sitting here going, oh my gosh, I wish she lived closer. Now I want to hang out with her. So anyway, I just love being with you, Josie. And it's been a while since I've been around a high school senior. I have really enjoyed this. I'm not surprised actually that it went so well, because I just sort of thought that it would. And I find too that when people just talk to one another, it's never really quite like the explosive fireworks, that we see the media sort of presenting. I don't mean to imply that there aren't really strong emotions. I don't mean to imply that there aren't lots of fireworks at school board meetings, but I'm actually quite sure that even some of the most intense exchanges at those meetings would go much better in a different setting if the 2 people or the 3 people, laid out these agreements ahead of time and tried to have a conversation. Something that I thought was really interesting was Krystle, when she immediately thought of the Pledge of Allegiance. And the reason I think that's interesting is because there is concern about students being asked, either required or pressured to take pledges in school, not the Pledge of Allegiance, by the way, pledges for other things, sort of like social justice cause pledges. But what's interesting is that the same people that are really uncomfortable with that pressure and those pledges are often people who really, really value and want their children saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And so that just, I think, is something to think about, right? You may hate this pledge, but you love this pledge. So wouldn't it be reasonable that someone else might like this one and not like this one? And so it just gave me something to think about. And I now have written it down as just something to think about and, talk about with some people. So thank you.
Thank you, Erika. Joe, how about you? What's your takeaway from today?
I had something in my head, and then after Krystle and Erika with the pledge and all that, I'm going to have to do an audible here and talk about that, because I think that is what I take away. Through teaching history and seeing, seeing how the kids respond to it, we take for granted, and I know myself included, I take for granted a number of things. And, I see the Pledge of Allegiance as that one agreement that we have, that this is the rules of the game. And when I see patriotism, I often hope that, and I see it in the media all the time, that patriotism is confused with nationalism, which are two different things. To me, Martin Luther King was one of the biggest patriots around. Patriotism is challenging society when it deviates from that social contract, when it deviates from what we say in the pledge. That is our patriotic duty, to stand up and say, no, that's not our agreement. Our agreement is that we are treated equal, and I'm going to stand up and fight for it. And I know it might seem that I'm coming from the white male perspective, but one of the things that I haven't shared until right now is that I've been happily married to my husband for 12 years. And I understand, there are places I've been where we've walked down the street and we've had to think twice whether or not you can do something as holding hands. And where I see me in society, and where I see anyone that has somewhat times felt marginalized in society, is, I go back to that pledge and say, look, this is what we're fighting for. We're in this society because we know it sometimes might take longer, much longer than needed. But I know that these ideals that are in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and that are emboldened in that pledge, that's what unites us. And what scares me is that we're now arguing not whether or not how we get there, but whether or not we tear the whole darn thing up. But what this group has really done for me is shown that there is hope. We can have rational conversations, and I think we should appoint ourselves all as the ambassadors to education, and we can fix this thing in another 2 hours?
I'll go last. I just have to say, when I first started thinking about this, and before I learned about Braver Angels, it's been doing this kind of thing for a number of years, and living room conversations. Krystle's been part of that. I shared this idea that I wanted to get people together around questions on education that thought very differently, and try to have a civil conversation. And some of my friends said, "Are you crazy? And how are you going to keep people from going off the rail?" And I just had this sort of gut level sense that if you turn down the volume and just agree to a few simple rules, that people would behave responsibly, they'd listen to each other, and learn from one another. And I'm so pleased, given this is our first episode, that it's actually happened, in my view. That and I think, Erika, you're right. When you get away from those settings where people, I think sometimes it brings out the worst of us, and you need to find settings where, like this, but not just on Zoom, but elsewhere, where we can do this kind of thing. So it just brings me to my final question, and I just wonder if all of you could think a little bit about how you in particular might be able to take what we've done here, this creating the conditions for rational and civil conversation about a really important idea, and do that in the settings where you work. Is there anything that you could imagine doing yourself to kind of promote this thing in your environment? Just this time, I'm just going to pause and allow you to raise your hand when you're ready, and then I'll call on you, because this is something that all of us might need to think about a little bit. You can raise your hand just physically. Joe, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I'll keep mine short and sweet. What I think we need to do is just continue to model this in our classrooms when we have diverse opinions. I think if the teacher can kind of disconnect from the passion and just question, because that's one of our roles, is to question and to help these kids become critical thinkers. I think if we just question and model this behavior equally, and we expect these expectations from our students, eventually the next generation is going to come around. And I think we'll get to where we need to be.
Great, great. Who'd like to go next? Kristin, can I turn to you? You're a school board member, and I'm just wondering, I don't know what your school board meetings have been like, but can you imagine any space in your district where you could create these conditions where people would have this kind of conversation?
That is the question that I've been mulling over in my mind. We, unfortunately, at our last board meeting, we had to go virtual because we had a bomb threat. And and then before that, we have had various militia groups show up and comments going until 2 a.m. And I understand that in board meetings, best practices are not to respond to comments. And I keep trying to think about how we as school districts create spaces for this type of conversation to happen. I think one of the key parts, the part that was really important to this conversation was, the ability of everybody to bite their tongue, to not interrupt, and to speak their truth. And I am going to move forward with figuring out how to create those spaces, because there's a reason why there's a saying, relationships aren't built in the boardroom. So I need to look at this model and see how I can encourage and implement it moving forward.
Thank you, Kristin. Josie, Krystle, Erika? Go ahead, Josie.
So every now and again I hear some political opinions or some people expressing their viewpoints that make me really want to discuss them more. So now I feel motivated to go and text some of my friends who think very differently. What do you think about income inequality? Or what are your views on immigration? And just talk about that. But I think specifically, I've had a very negative, I've thought about the other students at my school in a pretty negative light when it comes to open-mindedness a lot. But I've been trying to initiate that sort of conversation with my peers at my school, in addition to people I know from other places. And they've been more receptive than I anticipated. So I think I'd like to try to give people more benefit of the doubt and just hear more people's opinions to broaden and refine my own more, and listen to people from all over the political spectrum too.
Oh, great.
Not just about politics, about any issue.
Thank you, Josie. Erika, how about you? How might this affect what you do going forward?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I guess I sometimes see myself as more experienced than a lot of people right now in these arguments. And so I try to use whatever wisdom I gleaned from my own experience. A lot of parents are having their very first, they didn't even know who was on their school board 6 months ago. And now it's this is what they think about and do all the time. And so I'm able to sort of sit back, as having been doing this now for a decade, and having watched relationships that you thought could never work, and also sort of somebody made this point too, where finding other things to talk about or things that you can connect on, so that you are never going to fall into that trap of dehumanizing that person, because that's what I see happening a lot. And so I always try to turn down the temperature when people come to me a lot, they're upset. Parents, of course, I talk to parents all the time who are upset, and so just helping to sort of turn down the temperature, play devil's advocate a little bit, remind them that this person is not their opinion about this one thing. So I'm just trying to keep on doing that a little bit in my little corner of the world, in the hope that it'll help people move forward in a way that's productive. I think a lot of the conversations that are happening need to happen. I just think that they need to happen in a better way.
Yeah, just one of the things I learned from living room conversations is to if you're having them in person, is it's really important to bring food, because we all do that. We all appreciate it. But they always begin by asking some personal questions. And today, I think there was a whole bunch of common ground when we talked about our common positive experiences being in schools and what we hope for. And I think that kind of set the tone that we have an awful lot in common. And then it's hard to vilify the others when you've done what you described, Erika. Krystle, what are your thoughts about what you might be able to do in terms of promoting this kind of way of conversing with others who might disagree with us?
Sure. I intend on having more conversations like this. That's part of the reason I work with living room conversations. I like to hear perspectives of others. It actually made me think of another positive memory from school. In elementary school, we had an assignment where we had to look at various different news sources. Like it's something like 5 or 6, which felt like all of the news sources back in the 90s. But the point was to hear things from different perspectives. And so, and I'm guilty of this too, like, I think a lot of us are just in our circles. And so I want to continue to actively make an effort to talk to people who don't live where I live or haven't had the same experiences. And I also want to like try to find a way to do these conversation agreements in everyday life, because I mean, when you come to the table about passionate things, but we can all start with these basic agreements, the conversations go a lot better.
Krystle, thank you. And I want to bring things to a close now. And I want to do first thank all of you for being part of this and really participating in the wonderful way. I think we all managed to keep to our agreements that we read at the beginning. I thought it was stimulating. I thought it was thought-provoking. I thought it was respectful. And my hope is that those watching or listening to our conversation today will come away with the courage and confidence to engage in this kind of dialogue about our schools, especially with people whose perspectives may be different from our own. And for those watching or listening to this, if you want to be part of a future event, please go to teacherstories.org/conversations, and you can submit your name, your contact information, and tell us which topics you're most interested in. So I'm going to sign off now, and again, thank all of you, and say so long to everybody. Bye-bye.